Hello, and welcome to another edition of the Umoja Circle. My name is Keith Smokey Johnson, and I'd like to welcome you to another, I hope, profound discussion that would open your eyes. And for those of you who are new to the Umoja Circle, the purpose of the Umoja Circle is to correct errors where errors are found and to introduce facts where we find that so many people are listening to fiction when it comes to who we are as a people of African descent. And also, the premise of the show is that through dialogue, only through dialogue can there be a shift in consciousness. And when there's a shift in consciousness, that's when there's a shift in the world, the way in your world, and the way you view the world. And that is the process by which I discuss certain things. Today's topic is something that, as a historian, a junior historian, somebody who loves history, I've been noticing a troubling trend in how a particular aspect of African American history, and a very important aspect of African American history, is being utilized today, decades after these events have happened. And the icons and the people who represent that history, how they're being portrayed, not in a way that they should be from my perspective. Then I came across this book. I put it up on the screen. The first book, what I'm going to talk about, is based on what I read in this book. It's called The Rebellious Life of Miss Rosa Parks. Now, why Miss Rosa Parks? She's one of those icons that I think we're getting a wrong information on who she is. Yes, she's celebrated, but it's how she's celebrated and who's the one, how her image is being utilized. That's I'm going to use the first part of that. It's talking about that aspect of the book for this point. Then in the second show, I'll go to this book, which kind of continues on this uh, title of the show. It's called A More Beautiful and Terrible History, the Uses and Misuses of the Civil Rights History. And that's the history that I'm talking about, how it's being used. Both books are written by a professor at Brooklyn College. Her name is Janine Theo Harris. She got her degree. This is a white woman who got her degree at Harvard, her master's degree in African American history. That's was her major. And then I think she went on to get her doctorate degree at Michigan University. I'm not sure of the second one, but she in political science and history, American history. So she's very qualified. And the first book, you put that on, because put that image up again of the first book, The Rebellious Life of Miss Rosa Parks. Now, that seems to be antithetical to the knowledge of what we think is as Rosa Parks. Or she's one of those icons, say when Black Lives Matter is protesting, or people at Ferguson rebelled in the streets because of police brutality and a system that is not working for them. They will roll up her image and come up with this dialogue that say that, why don't you be like her, this quiet, diminutive person, this woman of dignity, all true. But the word rebellious is never associated with her. And in fact, this book says rebellious life of Rosa Parks. And the term rebellious that Dr. Theo Harris used came from Rosa Parks' own mouth herself. She said that she was always a rebellious individual. That doesn't go with the image of the quiet, demure, shy person who was an accident of history on that December 1st day in 1955 when she did not get off that bus. That's not the image that is being portrayed of many of the civil rights icons. That's what I wanted to talk about in these two shows. That this dialogue that is slowly transmuting from the truth of who they were agitators, rebellious, who pointed fingers at a system of racism and segregation and all the things that did not put the land of the free label to challenge that label for decades. But yet the dialogue that is being put out there is not what they had to deal with and the pushback that they had to, like people like Rosa Parks had to deal with. A lot of the kind of things that you hear from politicians today are utilizing these icons to push some type of narrative that doesn't fit who they are. I think what I would call a fable is being shaped about this period of time that was just as hostile, just as disruptive, and just as agitating as what's going on today when it comes to race relations in America. In fact, it was even worse because we are talking about a period of time when segregation was the way of the land. Even though black people were supposedly free a century before, the 1950s and the 1960s and the 1930s, they were still dealing with obstacles that affected their civil rights, that was reflected in the way the criminal justice system was dealing with them, housing issue, school desegregation. In fact, many of the same issues that are being talked about today by organizations like Black Lives Matter, by young students in college who are having to deal with black men who are having to deal with the criminal justice system. Housing discrimination are still being discussed today. And this narrative, this fable of the peaceful icons in the civil rights era that's always being carted out when you have some kind of street protest or some kind of sitting or some kind of agitation done by the youth today, they're trying to disconnect it, the two periods, and trying to put a false narrative that is used not as a way of connecting so that our children can learn that what they're doing, Rosa Parks did, Dr. King did, and other icons of the civil rights movement did. But the narrative state that, why don't you be like them? Quiet, demure, show love and peace to the system. Or it's being used to show that America is great again, okay? That the exceptional way of America is that we had this period of time in some long ago history, and these people fought that time, in that time, and segregation and racism was overcame, we shall overcome. And then the capstone was that we got a black president in 2008. And it's always in that frame that the civil rights movement, to me, was hijacked. Things still wasn't done correctly. We have to continue to fight to this very day. The same issues that are with us today in housing, like I said, in schools, and in the criminal justice system and job hiring is the same issues that motivated people, everyday people, during the 50s and the 40s to come together and fight the system, to agitate the system, to point at the system. And this image that is this fable of people like Rosa Parks is something that we got to be careful of how it's being utilized. Who was the sister, Rosa Parks? We all know about what happened on December 1st, 1955, on a bus in Montgomery, Alabama. But who was that person? Yes, many of us knew she was a seamstress. She was actually an assistant tailor at Montgomery Fair, which was the largest department store in Montgomery. And an image of her that is being perpetrated today, that she was tired, had sore feet, she just wanted to sit down. But in her own words, she said no, she wasn't that tired. She wasn't physically tired. She was tired of being pushed. And that was the last straw of that, what happened on that bus, where she was pushed by the driver, whose name was uh, James Blake, I think was his name. Yeah, James Blake was the driver of the bus, who she had issues with before, but we'll get back to it. But let me talk about this sister to let you know that the image that being perpetrated and the image and the fact of who she really was are two different things, and we got to be aware. Because even some of us, when you have Black History Month celebration, when we talk about the civil rights movement, we're talking as if it was some kind of love fest, that there was some issues and people didn't march, but they did it peacefully and quietly. No, they were agitators, because the system needed to wake up to the fact that what it claimed to be the land of the free was not true. And the system did not want to hear it, as it doesn't want to hear it right now. Rosa Parks was born in 1915, and her earliest memory was of sitting on the porch. Her earliest memory of protest or agitation and political activism was through her family. Her earliest memories was in, I think she was, she said, that this is her word from her writings and interviews, that she was 6 years old and remember sitting on the porch with her grandfather. Her grandfather, who was a follower of Marcus Garvey. And during that time, she was born in 1950, in 1921, when she was 6, and sitting on that porch, guess what she was looking for? She wanted to see her grandfather shoot a Ku Kluxer, a person with the Ku Klux Klan. And why? Because in 1921, after World War II, you had all these brothers, black soldiers, who went overseas to fight in World War I for other people's freedom. And when they came back home to America, seeing how they were treated in France and overseas, and the appreciation that the French did, were giving them awards and medals. But when they came back home, all they found was lynchings, being harassed by the police departments, unable to vote, and anybody who was associated with organizations that protested that, like the Garvey movement, there was white violence. You know, you had the riots of St. Louis and other cities where whites would rampage through black communities, destroying them. In 1922, you had, Black Wall Street in Tulsa. So it was dangerous times, and that's why her grandfather was there in Alabama, where they were living, the heart of the Confederacy, because even though the Confederate system was dismantled, the ideologies and the mindset of the Confederacy still existed in places like Alabama and Mississippi, and in some aspects it still exists to this very day in white supremacist type of thinking. So what has changed? But she does remember the first type of activism was her grandfather with his shotgun protecting his home from threats, real threats from people like the Ku Klux Klan and other paramilitary groups that were terrorizing black people after the Civil War. I mean, after the World War I and World War II. And the first real activist that she said she met was her husband, Raymond Parks. And this was in 1931 when she met him. She was like 18, I think, or so. And they fell in love. But what was he doing? Well, in 1931, he was one of the many people in Alabama who rose up to help what might be known to you in history is the Scottsboro Boys case. Uh, there were 9 young black men. Now this was during the Depression, the Great Depression, and there was all these images of black people who were just like anybody else, hopping on trains, traveling around America because of in the midst of the depression, looking for work. White men were doing it all over the place. We'd have images of the hobo jumping from train to train. Yes, it was illegal, but everybody was doing it to survive and find work in many different parts. And these 9 young black men were on a train. They got caught in Scottsboro, Alabama, and they were going to be charged just like anybody else, to fine for maybe do some time in jail. But coincidentally, 2 white women were found not in the same car with them, train car, but in a car, another car's 2 cars down. Had nothing to do with those 9 young men, but those 9 young men were, again, criminal justice system issues, were charged with rape. They were quickly put on trial and condemned to death. Now, their ages ran from the age of 12 to 19. And these black men were condemned to death just by being on a train that 2 white women were on, doing the same thing white men and other people were doing during the Great Depression. Yet they got charged with rape and were quickly tried, and so Raymond Parks was one of the many people in Alabama who were fighting to rescind that court order. And that was the first activism that she saw. And she joined Raymond Parks in that activism, doing the right criminal justice activism. So she was always, they got married in 1932. Okay, at the time of the marriage, he was the one in the forefront. She remembered having meetings to come up with strategies to deal with the Scottsboro incident. And she remembered seeing guns on the tables, not because they were radical, because they had to protect themselves, because what they were doing in Alabama during that period of time was dangerous. They wouldn't even give their everybody was called James. Okay, they all had the same name. They didn't know each other's names, so if one of them got caught and tortured, because you would be tortured or lynched just for having a meeting for criminal justice. And this is the environment that she grew up in. Not this demure, quiet, non-projecting black woman that's being portrayed today. That's the thing. She was no different than any of the black women who are in the Black Lives Matter movement, who rose up in Ferguson because of the criminal justice issue and the social and the city government that was to black people no different than what was going on in Montgomery in the 1930s, 1920s, 1940s, and 1950s, not equal civil rights. And when you have this new type of fable, and a fable is a story that might have a little bit of truth on it, but it has a lesson. And when this lesson is shaped to diminish the activities of young people today by saying that the civil rights icons like Martin and Sister Rosa Parks, even with the fact that there is a statue of her at the Capitol building to this day, Statuary Hall, even though the fact that there are many even Republican congressmen who talk about her name when they want to condemn what they see Black Lives Matter protesters are doing, or these young kids who are protesting the criminal justice system when it comes to young black men and young black boys and young black girls, and they're trying to use that fable to hide and disconnect these kids from the truth of the struggle that Rosa Parks' generation and Martin's generation had to deal with. Let them know that it's not any difference. She joined the NAACP in 1943 in Montgomery. Her and another, and the president of that NAACP, E.D. Nixon, they formed a team that made the Montgomery NAACP very socially active. In fact, Rosa Parks would go all over Alabama because they tried to find cases. They tried to bring to the forefront issues of when a brother was lynched. She would go to that town and try to get statements, try to get it into the courts, try to get issues that dealing with rape cases for black women, which was a prevalent during that period of time. So that took a lot of courage because you're riding through the back roads of Alabama, a member of the NAACP, in the 1940s. That's who Mrs. Rosa Parks was. But all those times and all those cases, in fact, the first thing that sent her to the NAACP to join it was that she thought it was wrong. She always looked after her brother, Sylvester. And this was during World War II, now 1943. He was overseas fighting for this country, and she was there, and she knew when he came back, he could not vote. She could not vote. And she thought that that was not right, and she wanted to vote just for the heck of it. And that's what she did. She got E.D. Nixon to get the paperwork together. She ran into obstacles, of course, all these voting rights issues that we're still dealing with to this very day. You know, there was a different test for whites, and there was a different test for blacks. The test for blacks was rigged so that they could not pass it, but Rosa Parks passed it. She failed a number of times, but she was doggedly determined to do it, and she did. But guess what? Even if she passed the test that she had to do, but then she had to pay a poll tax. In other words, she was trying to become a voting adult for 12 years. And even though she passed the test, they didn't do this to white people, but they did it to the blacks, she had to pay all the taxes, the fees that you needed to do every year for the past 12 years. She had to pay up all those different times. From the time she was eligible to vote to that time, she had to pay all those yearly fees, or those taxes, which was a lot of money for a seamstress at the time, but she did it. That's the kind of woman that she was, the dogged determination that she was. But she was so dogged, and another point I want to bring out about who she was, she got burnt out, okay? By the year of the incident that happened on that bus in 1955, she was burnt out fighting the system. So many of you who are just as burnt out today dealing with these issues and don't think you're going anywhere, you need to understand and learn from her if you don't know the truth of what she had to deal with. Not this fable that is being portrayed of her, of somebody who just happened to be on a bus in December of 1955 and did nothing else. You got to understand what she went through, that she was no different than you, that she was tired, that she did not think that it was even worth it at one time, until she went to a Tennessee with, and it was called the Highlander Folk School. And with the Highlander Folk School, this was in August of 1955, a couple of months, 5 months before the incidents in December 1st of 1955. And that was a school that started training, that believed that local people in local areas around the country know more about what's going on in their area. And those local leaders needed to be trained in how to organize and how to do things. They started out with the issues of the Depression, but then they started talking about school desegregation. And she went there for 2 weeks, and there was an eye-opener. She went there depressed, ready to give up, but it was an eye-opener when she saw blacks and whites working together for causes that she believed in. And after 2 weeks, they had that at the end of, like you have at the end of any type of workshop, what you're gonna do with this knowledge. She said, I'm gonna focus on the kids. Because even at that time, in that August of 1955, she said she didn't believe that the adults would back any of these civil rights issues. That's how tired she was. So on that day, when she did what she did, when she refused to listen to the bus driver, James Blake, okay? She didn't know that she would trigger a movement where the community went behind her. She didn't know that she would get the backing of all these people. She didn't know, and Martin Luther King, who was part of that movement, didn't know what they would become, the icons that they became. They did it anyway. That's the message we should be teaching our kids, because she focused on the youth, and there were others who rallied around her. She is a true icon, but she is not a museum icon that she's being portrayed as. She's just not a statue that exists in at the Capitol building in DC. She was an agitator. She was a fighter. When she was a kid, a white kid pushed her. She pushed him back and said, I don't want to be pushed anymore. How dare you? And she did that in front of his white mother, who threatened her. She didn't care. And that same thing happened on that 1 December 1955. She said she was pushed too far. She wasn't tired physically. She was tired of the abuse of that system. That is who Rosa Parks was. Okay, she died in 2005, and I call out her name. And I see you, Ms. Parks. I see you. So until next time, peace, hotep, bye-bye.